Let's look at some other virtues too. What about honesty, and specifically honesty with respect to yourself? Well, Aristotle says it's a mean between boastfulness and mock modesty, false modesty. Valla says that's not quite right. Honesty, he says, is a combination of two things. First of all, you do have to have a concern for the truth. So it's truthfulness as opposed to deceit. And that's pretty much the common sense view of honesty. But he says there's something else going on here as well, and Aristotle's right about that. It's a question of humility versus pride. The person who is driven to be boastful is driven not just by a willingness to deceive people, but by a pride that makes them want to inflate other people's opinions of them. The person who is falsely modest is the person who, well, not has real humility. Instead, they have pride, but think they'll look better if they pretend not to. And so he says, really, it's a combination of truthfulness and humility. Now, each of those can be understood in the common sense way. Being humble as opposed to being prideful, proud. And then in the other dimension, being truthful as opposed to being dishonest or being deceitful. He says it's a combination of those things, at least when you're talking about telling the truth about yourself. What about honesty more generally? If we think about honesty with respect to other people, for example, Aristotle says, well, that's a little different. Then honesty is a mean between two extremes again, but the extremes are deceit and rudeness. After all, you can be too truthful. Hey, how do I look in this outfit? You might be too truthful. You look terrible. And so that's something that makes a certain amount of sense. But Valla says, again, that's not quite the way to think about it. Here's the proper way to think about it. Honesty, in that case, is, yes, opposed to deceitfulness. It's truthfulness as opposed to deceitfulness. That's one dimension of it. But the other dimension here, he says, is just tact. Okay, you can be tactless or you can exhibit tact. And so the tactful person says, I like the other outfit better, okay? And doesn't insult you in the process of saying something true. So what Aristotle thinks of as rudeness, being too willing to tell the truth, Valla says, no, it's telling the truth in the wrong way. It's telling the truth tactlessly. And so honesty, as we ordinarily think about it, in these contexts anyway, is a combination of truthfulness and tact. And that's the way we should understand it. If somebody is too blunt and constantly offending people by being too blunt and being rude, the proper response often isn't to say, control your desire to tell the truth. Instead, it's, look, become more tactful, more concerned with other people. And there you can see how love and charity enter into the picture in the final analysis. What is tact but a concern for other people's feelings? Turning to generosity, Aristotle says, it is a mean between extremes. The most obvious is selfishness or stinginess, and the other one is profligacy. You're willing to give far too much away. And he says, that's not quite right either. Yes, there's the common sense dimension of generosity versus stinginess, certainly. But there's another dimension too. The person who is profligate. The problem there isn't really that, oh, they're too generous, though we might ordinarily describe it that way. The real problem is that they aren't being thrifty about it. They're being wasteful about it. So the two dimensions here are a matter of, well, really when you come down to it, benevolence as opposed to selfishness, and then thrift as opposed to prodigality. So the generous person is benevolent, concerned for other people, but also thrifty, helps them in the right way without wasting resources. The person who is wasteful in approaching this, it's not a question of just, being too concerned for other people. They're just, profligate. They're not really approaching this with a proper degree of thrift or concern for resources. The person who is too stingy is selfish. They're not benevolent enough. They don't care enough about someone else. So two ways to make somebody generous in the appropriate way. One is to try to get them more concerned with other people. The other way is to try to get them more concerned with thrift, with careful use of resources. Well, we could go through many virtues this way. Being good-tempered, for example, Valla says it's not a mean between the extremes of irascibility or being easily angered and being apathetic. Instead, he says there are two dimensions to being good-tempered. One is gentleness, as opposed to being irascible or easily angered. And the other is a matter of concern as opposed to apathy. It might be concern for another person, it might be concern for yourself, it might be concern about some sort of social issue or something else that might make you angry. Similarly with being motivated. Aristotle says there is a virtue that doesn't really have a name in Greek between ambition, which is somehow aggressive and too grasping, and being unambitious. And I think in English we tend to think of that as a person who's motivated. Well, if being motivated is a mean between extremes of being unambitious and being, as it were, too ambitious, then Valla says, yeah, again, I don't think that's quite right. Part of it is a matter of being aspiring, having a desire to get ahead or to make yourself better in various ways, as opposed to just, well, yes, being unambitious. But one of them is a matter of being agreeable as opposed to being aggressive. So being appropriately motivated is a matter of having aspirations, but also being agreeable, not doing it in a way that is vicious toward other people. So Valla's idea in general is this. Virtue terms typically have many different opposites because there are many different dimensions at stake, and each of those dimensions can actually be understood in more or less the common sense way, where we have a simple opposition between being concerned for others and being concerned solely for yourself, for example, or having concern about whatever and just being unconcerned or apathetic. And so we really can think of things in the common sense way, but when we analyze ordinary virtues, we realize there are combinations of things going on. And so it's not as formless as saying, you need practical wisdom, nor is it a matter of just suppressing or controlling desires, drives, emotions. He says it's a matter of developing the right positive emotions, the right positive sensitivities, the concern for other people, the concern about things that matter. Those are the things that we ought to be developing, giving people positive, uplifting messages, not saying suppress yourself, keep yourself down, but instead lift yourself up in the right kinds of ways. As an experiment, let's think about a more modern conception. It's there in Confucius, but it's often not there in ancient authors or even medieval authors, which is kindness. I think in the modern world we think of kindness as an important virtue, but think about the opposites of kind. There are a lot of them, including, well, aloof, antagonistic, cold, cool, cruel, disagreeable, discourteous, disliking, hard, harsh, hateful, inattentive, inconsiderate, indifferent, inhumane, mean, merciless, nasty, rough, rude, severe, thoughtless, uncaring, uncompassionate, unfeeling, unfriendly, unkind, unmindful, unsociable, unsympathetic, violent, and then, of course, general things like bad, bitter, ungenerous. Wow. Well, those aren't equivalent, obviously, and so right away you can think, hey, there seem to be a lot of dimensions here. And indeed, I think that's right. If we reflect on this more carefully, we can see a whole family of these has to do with lack of concern, lack of something positive, matter of being aloof, cool, cold, uncaring, etc. Those are a matter of lacking something positive. But then there's a different kind of lack. The person who is inattentive or indifferent, unsociable, hard, rough, inconsiderate, thoughtless, unmindful, is really, to some extent, not just not concerned enough, but not paying the right kind of attention even. It's almost as if one person lacks the love part, the concern for other people, the caring part, and the other sort of person just doesn't think about them. Okay, it's not that they think about them and think, I don't care about you. They don't even think about them. Kind of like in that meme, where one person says, I feel sorry for you. The other says, I don't think about you at all. There are two ways, you might say, I think about you and I don't care. And the other is, I don't even think about you. Those are two different kinds of lacks. But that's not all that's going on. Look at rude, antagonistic, bitter, disagreeable, disliking. Those are something different yet again. That's where I do pay attention and then I act in a negative way. I am in some way injurious, maybe severely injurious, and maybe just slyly or just rudely, but in any case, so it's not just a question of a lack of a positive. There's something actually negative. And then, of course, we have the general thing, that person's bad, or that person's unkind. But what does unkindness amount to? Well, it really amounts to maybe just not paying attention, maybe noticing but not caring, maybe actually responding in a negative way. So if you want to become a kind person, what do you need to do? you need to, first of all, pay attention to other people. Secondly, you need to care about them. And third, then you need to behave in positive ways toward them and not negative ways. So there is a kind of suppression there, a suppression for just concern for yourself, a suppression of any negative thoughts and emotions you might have. But to a large extent, it's a matter of developing positive things, developing an attentiveness toward other people, developing a concern or a caring for them, and then also developing positive ways of reacting rather than negative ways. And so again, Valla is saying it's not a matter of just knowing more or facing lots of situations and becoming practically wise or suppressing something. It's a matter of developing positive things connected to love, to charity, to a concern for other people. That's what really makes the difference. So in the end, with kindness, for example, we really might think of it as a combination of, well, 3 or 4 dimensions. One is a matter of being thoughtful as opposed to thoughtless, attentive as opposed to inattentive. One is a matter of being sympathetic as opposed to unsympathetic, having that care. One is a matter of being benevolent as opposed to selfish, actually thinking about the person and not only being sympathetic, but also then wanting to help. And finally, a matter of being positive and not being negative, being nice as opposed to being nasty. Kindness, you might think, has those 4 dimensions. And if we think about other things, integrity, for example, there might be many different dimensions that are involved in thinking about what it is to have integrity. So to summarize, Valla is giving us an alternative to Aristotle's picture, one that has to do with developing positive emotions, emotions of love, of charity, of benevolence, of concern. And he says that's really at the root of it. Yes, we have to not be overcome by fear or selfishness or a variety of other negative things. But on the other hand, the real problem for most people is not that they don't control those things enough. It's that they don't have reason to control them enough because they don't care enough about the positive things. I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis, who says the problem of the modern educator isn't to cut down jungles, it's to irrigate deserts. And I think that's Valla's view too. It's not a matter of suppressing or cutting down negative things as much as it is building up the positive things, irrigating the desert so that good things grow. The person who engages in criminal activity, for example, may well be a person who lacks virtues, but those virtues, well, it's not so much a matter that they just can't control themselves. It's a matter of not caring about the right kinds of things.